Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our second 8th Air Force week. And just talking to my guests there, we will in the future probably do a 9th Air Force week or an Air Force week that covers some of the other units around the world. And we will do another Bomber Command week at some point and cover other units. But 8th Air Force is on everybody's lips because of the forthcoming big series, which we're all looking forward to. We still don't have a release date. If you're new to the channel, I know a few people have come in from the 8th Air Force groups this week. So thank you for joining us. Don't forget to click subscribe so you get the notifications about the forthcoming shows and all the information you need. Links to my guests' books, their websites, and etc. is in the description below. That's where you'll find your resources. But anyway, our guest today is Dr. John Curatola, whose career has taken him from the Marine Corps via the Army Command and General Staff College to the National WWII Museum in New Orleans. He's going to talk about the 8th Air Force fighter operations. I'm going to bring John in now. So how are you today, John?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you.
So we were just discussing before going live there that it seems to me that when we talk about the 8th Air Force, a lot of concentration seems to go on the bombing formations. It's the B-17s and then the 24s, maybe second to that. The fighters, though, integral to everything. Why do you think there's less sort of discussion about the fighters in terms of how they functioned and the tactics than there is the bombers?
I think largely because while the fighters are certainly an offensive tool, okay, but I do think that the real strategic offense lies within the bombers' ability to project combat power on German cities and to destroy their ability to make the sinews of war. And so in that regard, the fighters are actually a supporting mechanism to the larger four-engine bombers that are, quote unquote, doing the larger mission of power projection, via a third dimension, if that makes sense.
No, definitely. And before we just bring up the PowerPoint, just remind us what you do at the World War II Museum and the projects you're involved in, what you've been up to since I last spoke to you.
Yeah, well, I got here just a few months ago, and first of all, it's just a wonderful place to work. I encourage anybody who's watching to come on down to New Orleans. The museum is first rate. It is one of the best museums I have been to, and I've been to, many across the globe, and it's just a really, really well done facility with a good team of people behind it. I personally am one of the military historians that work here. There's a handful of us that deal with the operational and tactical level history. We have plenty of fine people who understand what happened in the war, and what it all meant. But there's only a few of us within the museum who can go down into the individual units, tactical and operational, and really kind of dissect why this particular campaign unfolded the way it unfolded. What were the logistical considerations? What were the commanders at the time thinking? And so I and a few of my colleagues here, that's what we do now. We provide that kind of support. Our biggest mission right now is the museum is adding on to the existing facility. Starting in November of this year, we'll have the Liberation Pavilion. Is going to open up, and it really deals with the post-war years and what did the war mean? What were the lessons learned? What were the lessons not learned? And how did this set up for what we would arguably say the contemporary era, 1945 up into today and the future? And what does this mean for democracy? And so we've been working on the videos, the interactives, the displays, and a lot of work. It's amazing how much work has to go into a individual display. And it's a bit like, a lot of cooks in the oven or in the kitchen. Everybody has their perspective and, what are the main themes? What are the ideas that we want to project? And so that's taken up a lot of our time as of late because we're all pushing to get the pavilion open this coming fall.
Well, that sounds fascinating. Also, bringing up the subject as well as how museums have told the history, because the historiography of how we write and do podcasts and YouTube about the history is also replicated by the way the museums have told the stories. In that the Imperial War Museum and things like that have had different messages they're trying to send, different reasons, they're involved with the curriculums, things like that. So that's another interesting aspect is how museums have themselves taught it. But that's a rabbit hole we're not going to go down today. So, folks, John has provided me a fantastic PowerPoint. I'm in charge of it today. We will do questions at the end today because I think, to be fair, John is going to cover pretty most of it as we go along, but we'll do a question session at the end. But basically, I'm going to hand over to John now to take us through 8th Air Force fighter operations.
Great. Thank you so much. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As Paul has intimated for the crowd out there, yes, I was a Marine officer who worked for the Army, who studies the Air Force. So I kind of got the entire joint field covered in that regard. But truth be told, I really am just a frustrated B-17 pilot who was born 40 years too late. So that's kind of my background and how I, came to study this particular topic, which I find fascinating. For today's agenda, you can see here what I'm going to talk about. I'll go a little bit into the big beginnings of fighters and development and the technology. And this is one thing that people tend to forget about when it comes to the air war. These are the air forces in general are platform-centric militaries. Who has the technology? Who has the industrial base? Is generally going to be the most effective Air Force out there. So it's important for us to take a detour towards how these Air Forces were developed and the technology that underpins these airplanes. Then I want to take you into, some of the air theory and experience that occurs early on in the war years and in the interwar years. And something else that most people don't talk about is doctrine. Doctrine's kind of looked upon as something pretty boring and dry, and nobody wants to read it. However, it sets the parameters for how you are going to fight. And a lot of times it is a point of departure. But here with the 8th Fighter Command, as we'll talk about here in the early part of 1944, there's a huge doctrinal shift that occurs within 8th Fighter Command with the leadership that is there. That I'm going to go into that helps kind of explain how the air war evolves in 1944, and then, of course, for the rest of the war itself. And then I'll talk about Operation Argument, which is kind of the actual execution of these doctrinal adjustments. And then we'll look at some of the results of Argument and this change in fighter tactics and application. So with that kind of sets the parameters for where we're going. And go ahead and hit the next slide for me, please, Paul. Appreciate it. As we know, fighter aircraft first start in the First World War. Usually you have, observation is the first mission of early airplanes in 1914. And of course, we don't want the enemy looking at us. And so it generates anti-observation aircraft, which we know as fighters today. And we all are well aware of the Fokker Scourge in, 1915, the development of the Albatross fighters and those kinds of things. And the First World War really helps develop this idea of specialized aircraft, fighters, bombers, and observation aircraft and reconnaissance aircraft. And there's huge steps in aviation technology in this short 4-year span. But what it does is it sets us up for what happens in the interwar years, because as a result of the First World War, every major combatant, the UK, the Germans, the Italians, the French, the Americans, the Russians, everybody comes away with a different lesson regarding what future war will look like. And this is also reflected in the Air Force doctrines of the time as well. And so you have to kind of understand where the First World War ended as we transition into this interwar period. Next slide, please. And so let's get right into it. As we see in the interwar years, and most people here, I'm sure, are very familiar with, you have Amelia Earhart and Wiley Post and Charles Lindbergh, and so we had these huge leaps in aviation capability and aviation technology. You start to have higher horsepower engines. You ended the First World War with engines as much as 500 horsepower. They started out with 80 horsepower, and then 4 years later, you have ones that are 500. And now we're getting up to 1,000 horsepower plus by the time we get to the eve of the Second World War. High octane fuels are starting to come around. Most octane fuels were between 50 and 70, and now we're getting up to 100. Even up to 110 octane, which is important because high octane fuels produce higher manifold pressures, which it gives you more horsepower. And again, these are the kind of details that are often overlooked by the general historian, because it makes a difference with regard to airspeed and horsepower and the ability for the aircraft to produce horsepower at various altitudes. You also have the introduction of liquid-cooled engines. You can see here is a picture of a Merlin next to a radial engine. And this idea that you don't necessarily have to have this big, huge barn door out there with all these cylinders around it, creating all this drag. Maybe if we have liquid-cooled engines, you can have a little more refined frontage, reduce the drag of the aircraft itself, because you don't have these big huge cooling fins out there. But it's interesting when you look at a radial engine compared to an inline engine, there's pros and cons. Radial engines are easier to repair. Radial engines also are a little bit more robust. You can lose a cylinder or two and still get back. The engine will still produce some power, whereas your inline engines are a little bit more susceptible. You get a nick in the coolant line, well, now you have a problem, and so they don't take on as much robust capability, but because of their size and their where they're located, it allows you to have better horsepower and maybe also have a more streamlined approach to your aircraft itself. And so there's a pro and con here, but the idea here is that you have engine development here in the 1930s that are really affecting how high you can fly, increased airspeeds, increased payloads. And it's going at an exponential rate here in the 1930s. And a lot of it is resident. If you see the air races, of the 1930s, the Giebe and Wiley Post and those types, and they're largely reflecting this new change in aviation technology. And what's interesting is the civilians are really pushing this. The military is kind of lagging behind a lot of the air racers during this time, and they're latching onto the technology after civilians are actually producing it. So you kind of have a bottom rail on top relationship there, but the military, of course, catches up. Okay, let's talk about the interwar years a little bit in terms of strategic bombing theory. Most of you, I know, are well aware of what goes on in the bombing campaign, but at the Air Corps Tactical School in the interwar years in the 1930s, they framed this idea of daylight precision bombardment. The Americans look at precision, and as most of you know, the British don't. You look at the works of WWII and his ideas about, morale bombing. If you killed, 200,000 people, that will create such mayhem within a given country that they'll immediately sue for peace. It briefs well. Execution is a little bit different, but in the 1930s, you don't know that. What you see is Guernica. What you see what's happening in the Spanish Civil War, and what little experience you saw at the First World War. And we're going to take some of those experiences and take them to conclusions that aren't necessarily accurate. But again, there's no precedent for an air campaign outside of maybe the Zeppelins in the First World War. And so at the Air Corps Tactical School, you're going to develop the strategic bombing theory. And the one I'd like you to focus on is like that fourth bullet down. The bombers can penetrate enemy air defenses. The classic, the bomber will always get through motif that you hear so much about. Because with the advent of the B-17 and the B-24, you have, 13 guns, depending on the model of aircraft you're talking about. The thing is a flying porcupine. That's why it's called the Flying Fortress. Not only does it have the range, it can carry up to 6 tons of bombs, and it can defend itself. And so, again, this is what we briefed, in the interwar years as an application for strategic bombardment. And again, there's no precedent for this. And so a lot of this is guesswork in terms of actual doctrine. And that's important to remember, because now we're going to get into the execution piece of this and find some holes in our strategic bombing theory.
And just to interrupt, this has come up on World War II TV before, is it? And you made that point there, is people have got these wonderful PowerPoint presentations in the late 30s about what they think strategic bombing can do. But as you said, there's no real backup. There's no data to back it up. It's just, I think this, and these rivals, a lot of them coming from civilian background. There's theories in different countries around the world, but it's all just amazing. The equivalent, the 40s equivalent of PowerPoint presentation, but no real substance to it until the war begins. They can actually kind of find out what does and doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, since you brought that up and we're on the slide here that shows the difference between the British and the American applications. When I was actually doing some research a few years ago, I found a letter from Ira Aker, who becomes the first commander of, the 8th Air Force in England. And when he finds out that Churchill wants the Americans to come in with the British night bombing effort, he goes down to, on orders from Hap Arnold, who's the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps. He goes down to the Casablanca conference and he has an audience with Churchill to explain to him why the Americans are going to precision bombing. And he writes his letter to Hap Arnold saying, I told him that precision bombing is 10 times more effective than area bombing. And to your point, Paul, he has no precedent to say that. All he knows is what he had learned in the Air Corps Tactical School, what he thinks his command can do, but there's no precedent to say it's 10 times more effective. But that's what he sells to Churchill. And as you well know, the Butt report comes out, and it talks about the nighttime bombing of the British Bomber Command, and it says about a third of the sorties don't even hit their primary target. 2/5 of the crews come only within 5 miles of their target within a full moon, and 1 in 15 on a moonless night. And so the British realize, or they come to the conclusion that daylight precision doesn't work, so we're just going to go nighttime area because our losses were so horrific in the daytime. We're going to go at night. Well, as you well know, the Americans categorically reject that. And in 1943, as I mentioned earlier, when Ira Aker goes down there and talks to Winston Churchill, who wants to pull the U.S. into the RAF effort, he briefs Churchill. Again, he has no precedent, but Churchill leans back in his chair and he says, and I quote, "You haven't proven your point, but you have argued enough that you should be given the opportunity to prove your contention. As a result, you come up with what's called the Casablanca Directive in 1943. The British will bomb at night, the Americans will bomb at day, and what you have is both air forces will conduct a bombing campaign in accordance with their written doctrines." And it becomes formalized in execution in April of 1943. So that's how we're kind of crossing the line of departure here with regard to what we call the Combined Bomber Offensive, or the CBO. Next slide.
And just to jump in and say, Robin Pryor is joining us tomorrow from Australia, 9:30 UK time in the morning, to kind of continue this idea of the rival and then eventually agreed upon doctrines between the British and the Commonwealth and American forces. And I also want to just ask you something, John, about, I'm reading Larry Ferrero's book, Churchill's American Arsenal at the moment. And the Lend-Lease, I've always kind of thought of it as that kind of one-way thing of all that stuff going from the USA and Canada to the UK. But he is making me realize it was the money that went the other way, including gold, is also part of the contribution to develop American techniques. Is you get a huge influx of cash in 1940, 41, or 41 particularly to spend on this. Is that something that you consider important, just the amount of extra cash you've got?
Well, you got to think about the fact that both countries were in a depression. And one of the reasons why air power is so attractive in the 1930s is because it's relatively cheap. Yeah. This looks like war on the easy. And so as a result, the Defense Department, or War Department, as we knew at the time, doesn't have a lot of money because Americans don't want to budget for it. Okay. And we want to stay out of the war anyway. But now, as Roosevelt sees the war on the horizon, getting some of the scratch coming in will kind of help seed some of that development and some of those research efforts that are going on in the interwar years, or just before the Americans get involved. And there's a whole debate as the Americans are pushing Lend-Lease in early 1940 and 41. There's a lot of people who are upset about the Americans moving aircraft across the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean to help the British out. I just wrote an article about that last summer, about this air bridge and how it gets established. And it starts off rather clandestinely. They actually would fly aircraft up to the North Dakota border, push them across the Canadian border, and then have RAF pilots fly them to bases in Canada because they didn't want Americans landing aircraft in Canada. So there's a whole story behind it. But there is a point to this, that we're starting to kind of see these things coming on the horizon. So yes, I would agree with that observation. Now we're getting into the execution piece on this. And you can see here the early loss rates, as I have on the slide, are around 8% ballpark figure. Now, I'm a historian, not a mathematician, but you're going to require 25 missions before you get to go home. If you're losing 8 to 10% of your formation on a given mission, how long is it before your number statistically is up? Right around the 10th mission, ballpark figure given on that. And of course, you can see some of the numbers here during this time. In 1943, it took a survey of 2,051 men who went to the 8th Air Force bomber cruise in 1943, and only 599 lived to see 25 missions. You can see here the losses that are going on. 73% of the airmen that arrived in 42 failed to complete their tours of duty. And this is one thing, and as a Marine, I think this is a fascinating number. The 8th Air Force will lose, in terms of deaths, 26,000 men in the combined bomber offensive. The United States Marine Corps in the Pacific loses 20,000. More Americans are killed in B-17s and B-24s than U.S. Marines hitting the beaches on the islands in the Pacific. To give you an order of magnitude of how violent this campaign is and what the cost is for many of these men who fly this. During the Munster raid in October 10th, 1943, the 100th Bomb Group sends up 13 ships and it loses 12 of 13 ships. That's how horrific this is. And so what they're learning is this idea that, oh, the bomber will always get through and that it can defend itself is problematic. Why? Because what we're finding out now, which we didn't see in the interwar years, is integrated air defense. Something that Stuffy Dowding actually kind of foresaw, and we know the Battle of Britain and what occurred. The Germans now have radar, and they have anti-aircraft guns, and they have fighter interceptors, and they're doing, the direct opposite, same thing that Stuffy did, but on the other side of the equation now. And of course, you didn't see that in the 1930s, long-range, radar and those kinds of things. And so this is something we didn't necessarily plan for. And in the First World War, most aircraft were not shot down by flak, because there wasn't a lot of it. So again, there's no precedent. And so one of the things we come up with is this YB-40 Convoy Defender. It's basically a heavily armed version of the B-17 with an extra turret in it and some more 50 cals. Carries like 11,000 rounds of ammunition as opposed to the 4,000 normally carried in the B-17. It's got 18 guns instead of 13 guns. The problem is it's so stinking heavy that it can't keep up, especially after the bombers drop their bombs and now they're 6 tons lighter and they can fly faster and have a higher true airspeed, whereas the YB-40 is so heavy, it really doesn't provide the kind of defense the bombers are looking for. And so it's withdrawn after only a few months. But it's a recognition. Go next slide, please. Oh, I don't know how that got there. That's on the wrong slide. But at any rate, go to the next slide, please. There should be an air war planning document slide with Hansel.
I think it's under that one. I'll go and try and amend it and do something in a minute.
I apologize for that. But I'll talk to it as you go back. Haywood Hansel, who's one of the framers of the air war planning document, comes to the conclusion that a missing element of the American plan for the war, and I'll give you a quote, is neither air war planning document 1 or 42 called for escort fighters, and patently this was the greatest deficiency in both plans. We did not think it was possible to build an airplane that had a couple hundred miles of range that would have the maneuverability to enter combat. Go back a slide, please, Paul, if you could. Hence the ME-110.
Okay, yeah.
It's underneath that picture, right? That's a build slide. That's why I didn't pull up. Never mind. But the 110.
I'm getting it sorted. I'm doing a new one. Don't worry.
All right. It's a long-range fighter, but it's so stinking heavy and fat that when it tussles with a Spitfire or a Hurricane or any kind of single-engine fighter, it can't hold its own. And this is an engineering challenge. This is the problem, that we don't envision the ability to build an aircraft that can fly all the way into Europe, that can escort bombers, have maneuverability and firepower enough to take on a point interceptor. So this is an engineering challenge to a certain extent. And that 110 is one of these pictures of an abject failure of it during the Battle of Britain. The 110s are easy meat, for fighter command. And so as a result, what we're finding out here is that we need to solve this problem. And we also see there's proof in the pudding. Some of these, thank you. There's the quote from Haywood Hansel. I should have told you, Paul, that was a build slide, and I didn't. But that's this quote right there that I read to you. But in autumn of 1943, 20% of the bombers that are escorted get their bombs within 1,000 feet of the target. With fighter escorts, 40%. So again, if the bombs aren't hitting the target, then what's the point? And so what we're seeing here is the proof is in the pudding. When you have fighter escort, you're able to get more bombs on target. And so again, this is kind of the whole point of the bombing campaign anyway, is to get the bombs on the factory or in the airfield or whatever you're aiming at. So next slide. Okay, thank you for that, Paul. I'm sorry for the confusion. Now, we start off with, the P-47 and the P-38 as basically the fighters that the 8th Air Force has. And the 47 is a great aircraft. It's one of the first in theater. It's rugged. It's reliable. It's got a radial engine in it, so it can take a lot of damage. But it's very heavy compared to its German counterpart. It kind of has a poor climb performance when you look at the amount of drag that aircraft has, but it's heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns. But its ability to actually tussle and get into a dogfight with German fighters at medium and lower altitudes is kind of poor. Okay. However, at higher altitudes, the engine tends to have a misfire problem. They tend to have some mechanical problems at these higher altitudes. Um, what the 47 will develop, the tactics they will develop are basically zooming tactics, slashing attacks, not turning dogfights with FW190s or 109s, because the 47 just doesn't have the horsepower and the aerodynamics at these medium altitudes. At the higher altitudes, again, it's got some issues. Now, later versions will have water injection tanks put in that boost the horsepower a little bit, about 200 and 300 horsepower, and it'll help increase its climbing rate. But it's really great below 15,000 feet, but above, it's kind of a problem in terms of its ability to deal with the Luftwaffe point interceptor fighters during this time.
And a general question about improvements to fighters. Were the improvements as a result of examination of the data and losses from kind of a statistical point of view, or did they get information back from pilots and air crews as well about what works and doesn't work, or both?
Yeah, a little bit of both. Basically, there's thousands of people who are working in the intelligence field in the UK to decipher, hey, what's going on and how are our aircraft performing or not performing, mission debriefs from the pilots themselves of what they saw or what they experienced, and so there's a number of inputs that are coming in to make the aircraft better, faster, higher performance, and so what we thought in the interwar years would work great, we're finding out, oh, wait a minute, we kind of overlooked this to a certain extent. And remember, the Americans are kind of late to the game with regard to involvement in the war. We want to stay out of it. And so we have a lot to learn. We're the new kids on the block here. And this is relatively new technology at the time. So yes, we're getting that kind of information back. And so we're constantly reassessing. And this is kind of one of my historical points that I think about the United States military. We usually get punched in the face pretty well on our first engagement, but we're pretty quick to learn as an organization. I think the U.S. military learns relatively quickly, and we can debate that. But I think this is one of these cases in point where, hey, we need to replace the aircraft. There's better things out there for us to use.
And this brings us, I'm going to go down a little rabbit hole. I'm really hoping, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, that when we finally get Masters of the Air, the new 10-part series, it will address the learning curve. It won't just be a combat diary of 42 to 45. It will actually, hopefully, I'm hoping, I don't know, it will explain that the improvements, and it started off badly and they learned and they got better and better and better. And the 8th Air Force of early 45 was an incredibly different beast to the 8th Air Force of 42. And I'm hoping that comes across. I mean, yeah. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm sure you're in agreement with me that it should at least try and show that learning curve.
Yeah, and I would, if I may, self-promotion. The book I'm working on right now is how the U.S. Army learns to do amphibious assaults. When they go into Torch and Husky and Avalanche, there's a lot to learn. And the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy have to learn together before they can do Normandy. Yeah. And not that Normandy's done, perfectly, because we know there's lots of problems, but you have to learn. You have to develop capabilities and doctrine and tactics, techniques, and procedures. And that's what's happening in the air war here as well.
Brilliant. Right, P-38 now.
Yeah. P-38 is a really interesting cat, as most of you know, strange configuration, one of Kelly Johnson's, designs. It's for the first airframe that the 8th Air Force has. Great climb rate, great firepower. It's good maneuverability, again, at low and medium altitudes, but at altitude, she's got some problems. One of them is that her Allison engines tend to freeze up at altitude, because what you have is the cold and the humidity at altitude creates a lot of engine failures, which is kind of a bad thing when you're, at 20,000 feet taking on the Luftwaffe. She's got really poor crew heating. And I know that may sound like a creature comfort, but when you're in a cramped cockpit for 6 to 8 hours at altitude, and it's negative 20, 30, 40 degrees, yeah, it wears on you, and there's lots of stories of pilots having to be lifted out by their crew chiefs because they can't even, get up anymore. And again, you can see the list there. It's got a number of engineering challenges at altitude. It's an excellent gun platform. Most of your readers or viewers, I'm sure, are well aware of what it packs in the nose. It's a great gun platform, as well. And it actually is pretty maneuverable given how, it's a 2-engine fighter. But again, at the lower altitudes, and it's going to do yeoman service in the Pacific with its range and fighting, tasking with Japanese at lower altitudes. But at higher altitudes, this performance starts to drop off. And this is really well known within 8th Fighter Command. You can see by October 44, these things are removed from fighter command units as a whole. So, next slide, please. Okay, and here's the initial ranges that you have. Now, remember, we talked about the fact that the bombers have all this great range, but our fighters, our P-47s, you can see here on the slide, the Spitfires and the P-47s have relatively limited range without their tanks. Now, of course, the Germans aren't stupid, and they see the escorts coming, and they know the escorts are going to have to peel off eventually. So what do? They wait for the escorts to peel off, and then fights on. And so while we do have some fighter escorts, it's not taking you all the way to where you need to go. So that brings in, next slide, please, the drop tanks. Okay. And this really is such a simple application, but it's a game changer with regard to fighter support. 8th Fighter Command sends its first request to Air Force Materiel Command as early as October 1942 that they want these tanks. And the American logistics system is pretty slow in actually producing a fuel tank. And you think it's not just a receptacle that has a tank around. It has to be pressurized too, because when you get to higher altitudes, it has to be able to flow out, and you have a vacuum and those kinds of things. And so it has to work at a number of different altitudes and a number of different environments and temperatures. And that's more difficult than I actually think it is. And one of the things that the Americans will latch onto is that the British have already started using what we call paper tanks, is the term that's refused to them, but they're really just glue impregnated craft paper that they put over some formers, and actually they work pretty well. The 8th Air Force technical section by a guy by the name of Major Cass Huff, who is kind of overlooked. This guy is really an aeronautical engineer par excellence. He kind of latches onto these British paper tanks, and he adjusts them to be used on American aircraft. You can put them on the wings, or you can put them on the belly of the aircraft, and they come up with a whole series of different sizes and shapes of these drop tanks. They have 75 gallons, 108, 110, 115, even 200-gallon tanks that they actually use for this time. What's funny is the Americans send one of the British 108-gallon paper tanks to the Air Force back home to give it a test. They're already using it, but they send it to the 8th Air Force, and they come back and go, it's unsuitable for operational use. But we're already using it anyway. So, it's kind of one of those funny stories of how the bureaucracy is far behind what's actually going on in the field. Now, auxiliary fuel tanks were something that people thought about as early as the 1920s. However, one, they looked upon as a potential fuel hazard, or a fire hazard, excuse me. And another thing, too, is the Air Corps Tactical School at this time, in the 1930s, thought that endurance was deemed the least important characteristic of a fighter aircraft. So again, another oversight on the part of this, as we talked about, Paul, in terms of there's no precedent. We've never done this before, so we probably don't need to worry about it. And of course, we find out that we're wrong. Another problem with the fuel tanks is if you're a fighter and a fighter pilot, if I put this 108-gallon fuel tank on my belly, or I put it on my wings, what does that do to my maneuverability? What does that do to my performance? It's going to increase drag and those kinds of things. And so there's a reluctance on some commanders, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, to use these things. But they're important because they're not going to give you those legs that you need to escort those bombers all the way to the target and back. As a matter of fact, in 1942, they tell Hap Arnold, that, hey, we need these things, but yet the Army Air Force Materiel Command is still rather slow in actually producing these things.
But it makes sense. Again, your point earlier about the bureaucracy back in the USA, it would be impossible to keep up with the constant changing of the actual theater of operations where the 8th Air Force is facing. The changing German fighters, the changing conditions, the changing weather patterns, the changing needs. To be able to keep up with all that and try and anticipate in advance would be nearly impossible. It's always going to be some kind of catch-up procedure, surely, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and not to mention the fact that there's a whole other war going on in the Pacific.
Yeah.
So the Army Air Corps is not only fighting in Europe and in North Africa, it's also fighting in the Pacific, which has its own unique requirements to be part of the Japanese.
And probably almost certainly different, most of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there is a whole, a global Air Force problem that's going on here. And so as much as I just, threw some fault at Air Force bureaucracy, you also understand they're fighting a global war at this time, too. So it's something we should probably give them a break to a certain extent.
Yeah. Okay.
P-51. There we go. As most of your viewers know, the penultimate, in American fighter design. She's designed in around 100 days, ballpark figure. The British, of course, are looking for a new fighter. North American says, yeah, we can build you one. And they put together, the P-51, made it with an Allison engine. And then they realized, hey, maybe we should put that with a Merlin engine. And of course, the rest is history. The early P-51, I see a typo there, 51, the B and Cs only have 4 machine guns, but they have some feed shoot problems. Because if you look at the guns, they're kind of canted at a 45-degree angle to house the receivers in the wings themselves. And so they have kind of a jamming problem. And also the early 51s have a fuel tank that's behind the pilot that kind of throws the center of gravity off. Now I'm getting into the pilotage kind of stuff that affects performance on this. But once you come out with the P-51D with the Merlin engine in there, of course, you have the all-around good visibility with the bubble cockpit on it. She has an inline engine, so her radiator is a relatively small surface area. And most of your fans may know the cooler on the bottom, the doghouse in the bottom of the P-51 actually produced more thrust than the drag that it actually created through the Meredith effect. Not that I'm a scientist, but the cool air goes in, it expands, and then it comes out hotter and warmer, and it expands, and it actually adds to the thrust of the aircraft, which is kind of an ironic twist there with the design of the P-51. 6 machine guns, so she's got plenty of firepower. She's got plenty of maneuverability. She's got a good top speed, a good diving speed. And again, zooming attacks work well, but she can also tussle around with the Germans, the 109s and their FW-190s. And by 1944, the Americans are starting to give their pilots G suits, where it's good for another G or two, which can make a difference when you're in a dogfight. And the British also provide the Americans what's called the K-14 gyroscopic sight, which is better than the American issued one, and the Americans refer to it as the no miss 'em sight. Because it's good for deflection shooting and better long range capabilities as well. And so again, we have the aircraft now that can kind of meet the requirement that has emerged because of the combined bomber offensive. And when you make, next slide, when you make the P-51 with the fuel tanks, you can see now I can take off from East Anglia and go all the way to Vienna and go see the Van Trapp family singers before they climbed over the Alps and sought refuge. You can also see the P-38s have that great range as well. However, again, with the problems that the P-38 has at high altitude, she's got range, but she just, tends to not operate well at altitudes. But the 51s now, I can stay with you the whole time. So, next slide. Let's talk a little bit about how this is a notional fighter escort operation. This is just kind of how it would generally unfold. After they're clearing their base, they climb to about 25,000 feet and direct to where the rendezvous site with their bomber formation is. They cruise at about 250 indicated airspeed, and they'll go into a tactical spread at about 700 feet between aircraft and squadrons in relative positions. Once they rendezvous with their bombers, they'll go ahead and establish themselves in defensive positions, and I'll show you that. Now, it's an important thing to remember here, there's rudimentary navigation during this time. Yeah, there are some early navigation aids that are out there, but rendezvous sometimes went south, whether for the weather, poor navigation, maybe the winds aloft were different. It was a serious business, but a lot of times they didn't necessarily marry up. And I've talked to a number of B-17 pilots who still harbor some resentment about their fighter escort didn't show up as they were inbound. Okay. Visibility on a clear day was about 25 miles, but they did use radio contact to try to find each other. Of course, they knew the Germans were listening as well, but they want to make up the formation with the bombers and the fighters. The first air group would cover, one fighter group would cover a wing box, and the first squadron would cover the top front. The second squadron would cover the flanks from above, and then the third squadron would be high cover. And then what happened is, remember, the B-17s of cruise airspeeds around 125, 130 knots, depending. Well, fighters generally weave around 250. So what they have to do is they have to orbit around, or they have to weave back and forth to stay with the bombers because they can't go too far ahead. Well, think about that. If I'm doing that, that means I'm using gas at an exponential rate because I'm not just going in a straight line. So what they actually come up with is a relay system to where a fighter group would escort a bombers from point A to point B, and then at a designated location, another fighter group would relieve the first fighter group. Those guys would go home or go tear up Europe with their 50 caliber machine guns, and that next group would now escort those bombers maybe to their target, weaving over the top or flying orbit tracks. And so they had to rotate the fighter squadrons because they, would use up their fuel as well. Okay?
And was there friction between the bomber units and the fighter units about what was expected of them? And I'm thinking of that we've done shows in the past about the interdiction in North Africa and the Western Desert, what have you, and the Navy saying they wanted fighter cover to do this. The fighter people saying we can't do that, but we can do this. The people on the ground saying, yeah, but we want you to do this, and this confusion of ideas. So I'm assuming the bomber formation, the bomber groups wanted something from the fighters that the fighters couldn't necessarily do. So the fighter said, well, we can't give you that, but we can do this instead. Was there friction and tension at times?
There is. And if you hold on to that question, I think I'll get to it here in the next slide or two.
Brilliant. Let's do that.
Here, this is the best I could do in without having a three-dimensional capability here. But you can see basically with the blue squiggly line, you have a fighter's element or squadron above that's weaving, and 2,000 feet above is another one that is above the bomber formation, and they're kind of stacked. And so they're weaving on top of the formation as it's moving forward. And then you have another squadron that's 3,000 feet above that's providing top cover for that. And so this kind of gives you a notional arrangement of how this weaving occurred while they're orbiting around these slower bomber formations. And if you go to the next slide, if you didn't have a full complement of a fighter group, maybe if you only had a squadron, what they would do is they would orbit in between bomber formations themselves, orbiting around waiting for something to happen or relief from another fighter squadron as they were doing the relay system with these things. So that kind of gives just a notional idea of how these relay systems work and how they actually provided fighter cover. Now, let's go to the next slide, and I'll get to your question here, Paul. Things are not going well, as most of you know. By the fall of 1943, Hap Arnold is not getting the results out of the 8th Air Force that he expected, because one of the things that's driving the U.S. Army Air Forces throughout the entire war is that Hap Arnold wants to establish an independent U.S. Air Force. You don't have one yet, still part of the Army. And Hap Arnold is looking at making the biggest impact through air power that he can to establish an independent U.S. Air Force. And when the combined bomber offensive is getting decimated and it's not getting the results he expected, okay, he takes his friend Ira Eaker, who's in charge of the 8th Air Force, and he reassigns him, let's put it that way. And he sends him down to the Mediterranean. Now, the excuse that is used is that, well, with Overlord coming up, Ike is used to working with Medal of Honor winner Jimmy Doolittle, who's down in the Mediterranean Air Force. Ike knows Jimmy, so he wants to work with his own people. That's the excuse that's given. The real thing is Ira Eaker gets fired. Okay? So Jimmy Doolittle comes and is put in charge of the 8th Air Force in January 1945. Now, something else happened on the way to the forum. 8th Fighter Command is under the command of a guy named Major General Monk Hunter. You see the mustache there. He's really kind of one of these swashbuckling fighter pilot types that you read about. And he despite that kind of a reputation, he really sticks to what American fighter doctrine has published at that time. And in Air Force Manual 1-Tech-15 in 1942, it says the fighter's missions precludes their seeking to impose combat on the other forces except as necessary to carry out the defensive. So what he's really pushing is his fighters to defend the bombers without pursuing the Luftwaffe. Okay? And it makes sense. And of course, you want to get the bomber guys home. But Hunter also has a problem with the Air Force is only now getting its legs under it. It only now is getting the range it needs. It's only now getting the numbers of pilots and aircraft. And so, to be fair, he was there during the experimentation phase. He's a little bit too wedded to the existing fighter doctrine of the time. And he, too, is a little bit reticent about these drop tank things because what they do to aircraft performance. Well, again, because Hap-Arnold expects more, he's fired in August/September of 1943, just before Doolittle shows up, and is replaced by William Kepner. Now, here's a great story. When Jimmy Doolittle takes over in January 1944, he goes down to 8th Fighter Command, and he meets with Bill Kepner. And there's a sign in the headquarters of 8th Fighter Command. And the sign says, the missions of 8th Fighters is to bring home the bombers. Well, Jimmy Doolittle looks at it and he says to Kepner, who put that up there? And Kepner says, well, it was here when I showed up. He says, well, take it down and put a new one up. The new one's going to say the mission of 8th Fighters is to kill the Luftwaffe. So what you have now, next slide, please, a change in the doctrine. Okay, so what you see on the top is what the Air Force said in Manual 1-Tech-15 in 1942, but Jimmy Doolittle changes this to this idea of what's called ultimate pursuit, meaning you go after the Luftwaffe. Okay, you know, yes, your job is to protect the bombers. However, we want you to go after and kill Luftwaffe because that's what fighter pilots do, kill people. And so what we're doing now here is we are taking Air Force doctrine and we're turning it on its head. We're no longer just going to protect the bombers. We're going to go after the fighters themselves. And to a certain extent, the Luftwaffe's weakest link is the amount of fighter pods they have.
Yeah.
The Germans have been at war since 1939. And the Luftwaffe itself was a great military force in 1940 and arguably into 1941. But by 1942, it's starting to show a lot of stress. And that's why there aren't a lot of Luftwaffe fighter pods around in 1946, if you get my drift on this. Yeah. Later on in the war, the Americans and the British will be sending trained air crews with 300, maybe even 400 hours in type, whereas the Luftwaffe, it's dropping down to 50 or 60 hours, in type. And so I can build more airplanes. I can't build more pilots necessarily at the same rate as I can.
Which also brings up the subject of when people say, well, why weren't some of these initiatives taken earlier in the war? Well, earlier in the war, they might not have worked because the Luftwaffe was a different force earlier in the war. So just saying because something comes in, let's say a new bit of tech comes in October 44, why didn't we have it in October 42? The situation in October 42 was completely different. So it's everything is evolving, and that nothing happens in a vacuum. So there's the developments being made by the 8th Air Force that are happening concurrently with the situation in Europe on the ground is changing. Luftwaffe situation is changing across its theater operations. The situation in the Russian front is changing. So of course you can't always backdate things and say that would have worked earlier because it's an unfair comparison.
No, and by the same token, you look at go back to the interwar years again because I think this is important. The British and the Americans look at strategic bombing as an application. The Luftwaffe doesn't. It's really a tactical level force. It doesn't have heavy bombers. It has an HE-177, tends to catch on fire, which is a problem if you're in a bomber. But, it's really a tactical level application. It's great for close air support and those kinds of things. And it really kind of shows its weaknesses as a power projection force over the Battle of Britain when your 109s can only fly up to London for, 15 minutes. Then they kind of come home, And so you see doctrinal differences between the two air forces. that are really starting to come to flower now, if I can use that term. And you're right, the war is unfolding in ways that they didn't perceive it to unfold. And the Americans and the British are able to adjust much easily than, say, the Germans do. Economically, socially, politically, militarily. That's one of the things that why the Allies win. We're much more flexible with our applications in power this time. And even Adolf Galland, who most of your fans know, the head of Luftwaffe fighter inspector of German fighters, he says when the U.S. fighters went on the offensive, we lost the war. He goes, when they were no longer glued to the slow-moving bombers, whenever our fighters approached, the Americans hurled themselves at them. They went so low on level attacks, we were nowhere were we safe. The Americans attacked with overwhelming superiority. And so, again, this is a game changer here. It's a doctrinal shift, but you also now have the tools in place with the 51 in the range. So it's a marriage of things. So next slide, please. Okay, Operation Argument. And this is, again, the beginning of this attrition of the German Luftwaffe here. We're not only going to, yes, we want to bomb German factories and tanks and production and transportation, but during Operation Argument, during the big week in February 1944, we are specifically going after German air power, their bases, their factories, the Luftwaffe itself. And so we're going to do this with our British counterparts, again, night and day. And we're going to do this to draw the Germans out. This is done specifically to destroy the Luftwaffe. And if you go to the next slide, you see the schematic of how the big week unfolded. The 15th Air Force flying out of Foggia in southern Italy and the 8th Air Force out of East Anglia. And they're going after component manufacturers in Leipzig, 88 Ju-88 production in Bernburg, Regensburg, Augsburg, Brunswick. And again, we're going after their production capacity. At the same time, we're going to take the fighters on and not just stick to the bombers. Next slide, please. And as a result of the big week, it's pretty bloody. Okay, the Luftwaffe is going to lose a third of its single-engine fighters. Okay. And its fighter production is going to be like 40% of what in March is 40% of what it was in February. However, you're going to lose a lot of your pilots. And as a result, the German aircraft industry starts to disperse. Well, I'm not an engineer, but when you start dispersing your production facilities, it's not as easily done. It is not as well connected in terms of parts and supplies and those things. And so it requires much more effort to make the German aircraft that they have. And we all know that German aircraft production goes up exponentially. But of course, by 1944, you have every man, woman, and child in Germany making the sinews of war. It's no longer a balance of guns and butter in the economy that Hitler was trying to do in 1939 and 1940. I actually had an office mate years ago whose mother-in-law, this is a true story, was a Luftwaffe flak sergeant in 1944. And when she was a young girl in 1942, they told her you have two choices. You can go in the factory or you can go man a flat gun. Which one do you want? And so while you see these production rates go up, it's because they're now fully mobilizing their industrial capacity. One of the faults we had with the combined bomber offensive is the Americans thought the Germans were already at 100% capacity, and they weren't. They were only about 3/4 of their capacity, so they had plenty of slack. And so that kind of speaks to why you see fighter production go up. However, hit the next slide, please. You look at what the Air Force loss rates compared to the German loss rates. We can absorb these because I have my entire industrial base in the United States and to a large extent in the UK, producing more B-17s, more P-51s, and more importantly, more pilots during this time. From March of 1944, German fighter production goes down 56%, but it loses 22% of its crews, trained airmen. And during this time, the Germans are starting to rob Peter to pay Paul, and they're asking bomber pilots and attack pilots to start getting into home defense units to man the 109s. There's a great quote from a 109 pilot during this time. He says, every time I closed the hood to my fighter, I feel like I'm closing my casket. In a 3-day period, one German squadron of 25 pilots loses 5 killed in action and 6 to casualties, with 2 severely wounded. So again, that's only 25 guys, and you just lost basically half of your squadron in a short span of about 3 days. And so what you see here in the West is that the U.S. 8th Fighter Command has now established air superiority during this time. And the Big Week is kind of the beginning of this attrition in the air, but we're taking it to them. And this is one of the things about the American military. We fight away games. We don't like to fight home games for a lot of good reasons. And so what you see now is the ability to power project air superiority over the enemy homeland. And that's significant. And you can see here German fighter losses starting for 1944. The big week in February, and it starts to go up exponentially. February and March kind of goes down again, but then it starts going back up. Again, this is an attritional fight in the air now that the British and the Americans can win because we have more men, more equipment, and we're a little bit more flexible with our doctrines. The Germans, not so much. Next slide, please. And again, this speaks to the training piece on this. I'll let you kind of digest this particular slide. The black you see are total flying hours for the Germans. And then you see the hash marks, ones for the Americans and the British. And you can see how that changes exponentially from 1939 to 1944. I'm a private pilot myself. You know, I can fly a Cessna 172, but I've never had to apply that as a tool of war. I can fly an airplane, take off and land it, navigate it, but to actually apply it as a fighter pilot or an attack pilot, that's an entirely different skill set. And when you're not getting the hours you need to understand your airframe, your ability to apply it as a weapon, you have a significant problem. And the 109, as most of your fans know, is notorious for taking off and landing because it's got that narrow track landing gear, you know, and she's kind of a squirrely little thing at low air speeds, you know, and at low altitudes. So again, you have these problems with the German Luftwaffe. She is dying here in 1944.
And there were some comments in the sidebar about the accuracy of German figures, both production-wise and flight. But even if we adjust those figures and say yes, well, we're not, the trends are still there, though, aren't they? Even if you allow for some variation of accuracy, you can see what's happening, you know.
Yeah. Well, the same thing. If you go back as early as 1943, when the Americans and the British go into Sicily and take over the Gerbini airfields just south of Mount Etna, they captured dozens of German aircraft that are sitting on the airfield for lack of simple spare parts. You know, tires, oil, you know, those kinds of things. So German aircraft production and the sinews for maintaining an air force is already starting to break down. And, you know, and of course, the Germans are engaged on the Eastern Front fighting, you know, the Russian Air Force. And so you think about how much production capacity the Germans have compared to what the Americans and the British can put together. And this tends to be a war of numbers to a certain extent.
Yeah. Which brings us to the next slide, which, I mean, yeah, it's pretty obvious what's going on.
And so, you know, the Germans this is an attritional fight on the ground now. And the Americans have clearly, by second half of 1944, have clearly established air superiority. Doesn't mean that operations like Bodenplatte don't take place, and they do. And there are those times and places where the Germans will muster up. But what you see now is total air dominance by the United States Army Air Forces, along with our RAF counterparts. And of course, once you're on the continent, now I'm bringing in my P-47s with 9th Air Force. And they can also tear up German airfields because now they're within range. And so you kind of the threat against the German Air Force is now multi-domain in terms of both on the continent and off the continent, you know. And so there's lots of problems here for the Germans during this time. But you're right, those numbers, if you look at the Strategic Bombing Survey, you know, you can take those numbers with a grain of salt, but it gives you a trend. It gives you an indication.
It's the trend that matters, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
So there you are. That's it's been mind-blowing, and we've there are numerous rabbit holes we could have gone down during that presentation. Drop tanks, you could do an entire week of shows
Absolutely.
about drop tanks and their uses and developments and problems. Like we could do an entire week about US Navy torpedoes in World War II and what worked and what didn't work. But we'll do a few questions now. One of the ones that did come up is fuel. The high octane, things like that, Germans, allies. Have you got a little summary of of your opinion about how fuel differences fuel made a difference?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It's ironic that Jimmy Doolittle, who becomes the commander of 8th Air Force in 1944, in the interwar years, he works for Shell Oil Company. And he's also an avid air racer. Most of your fans are probably familiar with that. And he's pushing high octane fuels in the 1930s, where the Germans don't really latch onto this idea till later on in the war. And so again, you're talking about technology and horsepower at altitude and this race for higher, faster, and better. The Germans are kind of Johnny come lately. They do produce some high octane fuels, but by the time they do, the jig is up. The Americans and the British have already established their dominance. But again, it's one of those things that in history that tends to go overlooked because it makes a difference. It allows your aircraft to perform so much better at a time when they're actually at a disadvantage in terms of their range and those kinds of things. It kind of helps, level things out early on. And then it becomes, a significant factor during the war. And again, it's something we tend to overlook because, let's face it, bulk fuel is not sexy, but it makes a difference.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's all about those minor percentages, isn't it? It's like in sports, isn't it? That whether it's American football, but the team that gets just a 2% extra pass completion or 2% faster, it makes a difference over the course of a game. But anyway, we'll do some more questions. Ian Carr is asking, which will be right up your street as a former Marine, did the U.S. Army Air Force consider any of the Navy fighters, in the particular the Corsair?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, and I always like to say not that I'm aware of, because there might be some document somewhere that shows that they did. But as far as I've studied, no. The Department of the Navy and the Department of the Army or Department of War didn't like each other very much. And so they didn't necessarily cross-reference very much in terms of that. Now, as you well know, the Corsair, even the Navy didn't like it when it first came out because the nose was too long. So what do? They gave it to the Marines. We'll take anything we can get our hands on, kind of thing. And so as a result, I've never seen any documentation that supports that they even looked at it as a possibility, because it was always conceived as a carrier-based aircraft with the short wings or the short stubby legs, but the gull wings and the big propeller. So not that I'm aware of that they ever did that. Now I know the Brits had some Corsairs.
They did. We did a show about them at the kind of anti-kamikaze thing at the end of the war. But right. Great question from Emmy here. What's your opinion of Arnold's priority change for drop tanks, escort fighters in February 42?
Yeah. Again, Arnold's fighting a global war, and he's got everybody barking up his tree about, I need this, I need that. I don't have enough of this, I don't have enough of that. And while I'm Monday morning quarterbacking this thing as a historian going, drop tanks are important. When you're in the fight, when you have all these competing requirements from multiple theaters, I'll give them a pass to kind of, I missed this one kind of thing. Because again, we're fighting in the Aleutians at this time, and we're trying to stem the Japanese tide, in the Pacific, and so as a result, I give him the pass. Yes, should he paid attention to it? You're right, he should have, but he's got a bigger fight, on his hands, and he's managing an entire bomber fleet, a fighter fleet, an air ferry fleet. We're ferrying a global airline, to move troops and supplies to China, Burma, India, to North Africa. He's managing an entire a global air force. So I'll give him a pass on it, but your point is well taken.
Okay, so we've got another few for you now. Was the fuel produced in the UK or brought over from the US?
If I remember correctly on my history, we produce it, bring it over, and then I think the Brits start making their own, if I remember correctly, but please don't quote me on that one. But I think we initially moved it over, and then you guys started making your own.
Okay, this is another one from Ian there, and I'm going to word it slightly differently. What future plans were there for bomber and fighter aircraft in 1946 against the ME-262? Yeah. So if the war hadn't ended, would they have changed things because of jets?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it's a fun one. But in my personal opinion, and I mean, we can have this over a couple of drinks and argue it. The 262 is a phenomenal aircraft, way ahead of its time, all kinds of things, no question. I don't think the 262 is going to change the course of the war for the reasons we've discussed: manpower, industrial, supplies, fuel, all those things that air forces require. The Luftwaffe was already dying, and a few squadrons of 262s maybe protracted the war, maybe, but would it made a difference? I don't think so. Just because sheer numbers and the way the war was executed by the time it becomes operational, the die was kind of already cast. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. So please don't misinterpret what I'm saying there. But I don't think the 262, it may have protracted it a little bit, but I don't think it was a game changer if the Luftwaffe had more 262s.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Thank you. This one is potentially a long one, but we'll try and keep it a briefish response. What quantitative evidence was there that Doolittle's tactics made a difference?
Yeah, well, when you look at the German fighter losses and bomber survivability losses, and the fact that as bomber losses become less and less in 1942, the requirement for those air crews goes up. What I mean by that, in 1943, you got to fly 25 missions before you go home. Well, as things start to ease up, they raise it to 30, and they raise it to 35. And there's a lot of gnashing of teeth, don't get me wrong, but as the Americans start to establish themselves, the loss rates go down, and you can see where, hey, the guys are coming back home in record numbers than previously, and we're putting more bombs on target. There's more claims of Luftwaffe fighters going down. So there are a number of metrics you can look at that would show the quantitative changes in the doctrine.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great one from Gary here. What do you think about Acre's decision in September 43 or thereabouts to turn over all the newly arriving Merlin engines P-51s from the 8th to 9th Air Force?
Yeah. Because, again, I'm going to Monday morning quarterback it on this one a little bit. Because 9th Air Force is there to basically be the close air support for 3rd Army as they're, doing Operation Goodwood and Cobra as they start pushing and to the east. And at lower altitudes, 47 is great. As I said, at medium and low level altitudes, it's great. And it can take a lot of punishment, especially when you're flying low level where people are shooting at you, and those kinds of things. It's a perfect weapon for that for its time with its 850 caliber machine guns, and you can carry out the kitchen sink on it. And so by prioritizing your fighter with the P-51s at altitude and then pushing your 47s down the 9th Air Force, I think it's just good air fleet management on the part of Acre and 9th Air Force.
Now, there's about 3 or 4 more to go, if you don't mind. Does John feel the U.S. Army Air Force was held back in winning the air superiority because of the conflict within the U.S. Army and U.S. Army Air Force?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is actually a question that depends on what theater you're talking about. When you go into North Africa and in Sicily, the Army Air Corps is really on their own sheet of music. They don't see themselves as a close air support kind of mission. They see themselves as going what we call battlefield air interdiction, going long, hitting railroad yards and bases and stations, far beyond the battlefield. And the Army's like, hey, how about a little something for the effort? How about some close air support? And even when we go into Sicily, there's still this debate. And the Air Force will point to the operational manual 3-TAC-0 in July of 1940 and go, we are our own independent component, and we don't have to necessarily follow the ground component. And that's a problem because it's a joint fight. And one of the things that makes the American military so good is we learn how to fight joint. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, air, land, and sea. And the Americans have to learn that. And what you see in the Mediterranean is we start doing that. When Avalanche comes, when they land on Salerno, the Army Air Force is there on top of the fleet, providing close air support, not only for the troops ashore, but also the boats. And then the 12th Fighter Command in the Mediterranean will actually put a air command and control element on the Navy boats to help coordinate air support for the troops ashore. And so again, we have to learn these things as a military. And the Air Corps didn't always agree with the ground forces, but again, we learn these things, and it takes a while for them to kind of figure out what's the best way to go. And again, I'll go back to my thesis that the U.S. military screws up a lot, but we learn fast.
And I think, yeah, well, I agree. I think this idea of the learning curve often gets lost because books thrive on tension between the nations, problems here and there, and things that weren't overcome. And the fact that most of these organizations, and I'm calling them organizations when, of course, they're military formations, is the learning curve is definitely there. You look at it with the US Navy, with the British Navy, with the Royal Air Force, Fleet Air Arm, but that doesn't really sell. Just gradual improvement over time isn't really sexy. Conflict, disagreements, things that didn't work is much more book sales. But well, another question there from Military History and Wargaming: would B-29s have been used in Europe if the war had gone on longer?
No, the 29s were never, when they were conceived. Let me back up. When they were conceived in 41, we did think, hey, if Britain falls, we're going to need some kind of hemispheric defense weapon, and we can fly out of bases out of Turkey or Egypt and hit the Germans that way. But of course, the UK holds on. So after that, 29s are never even considered for the European campaign. They do fly one there, just to kind of tease the Germans a little bit to say, hey, guess what's coming next? But there was never a real plan to use 29s in the European theater. They're always designated for the Pacific. Why? Because they certainly have the range. And in the Pacific, the B-17 is a little bit limited in its capability to those ranges. The 24 is better in terms of range, but the 29 has such superior performance capabilities that they don't really need it in the ETO. And so, again, we kind of faked the Germans out by flying one there late in the war, but never under serious consideration.
Well, I thank you for that. I think we will leave it there. But what it has proven is that there's lots of questions out there. So I'm now considering at some point in the next series of 8th Air Force shows, we'll do just a question and answer panel discussion. Someone like yourself, or maybe Robin Pryor from Australia, I don't know, and just thrash out some of these questions, because clearly people here have lots of opinions, lots of views, lots of questions, and that's great. But we would be here all night or afternoon for you if we went through every single question. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second to remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll bring you back in a moment to say goodbye. So, folks, 2 shows tomorrow morning. Tomorrow, 9:30 morning, it's Australian historian Robin Pryor is coming on. We're talking about this ongoing debate between the doctrine of the US against the doctrine of the Commonwealth and strategic bombing and combined bomber offensive. That's going to be Robin's views on that, which will be different and interesting because he's fantastic. And then later in the day, Colin Kelly, who's watching, he's going to be continuing this idea about daylight bombing, precision bombing, target bombing. There's some amazing data and graphs and statistics there that he'll be bringing to you. So we'll carry on this conversation. So again, don't forget, if you're new to the channel, to click subscribe. The links you need there in the description below. John has been on before. The link to his previous appearances in the description below. He's written a few books. There are links in the description again below. But I'm going to bring John back in to say thank you very much. It's been great. Did you enjoy talking? Did you like the quality of questions?
Oh, I love it. This is great. It's great to give a presentation to an audience who knows the history already, so we can do some dumpster dives in terms of some of these harder questions. And this is the beauty of history. You have an opinion and I have an opinion, and we don't have to agree, but we can certainly have a good discussion and a fun time doing it.
It's all about the process. It's the process of debate, and that's what's great about this channel, and that's why I do the shows live, so we get the interaction, so we get the little disagreements and the agreements and the have you read this, and you should have seen that, and this channel there. That's what makes it so much fun, and why we will still be talking about World War II when in my case I won't be old and grey. I'll just be old because I don't have any hair, so I won't be grey. But anyway, thank you, John. It's been great talking to you. Thanks everybody. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.